What if it's all important? What if the DNA uses laws of nature, quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, things that we don't even know yet?
Mhm.
And by creating changes in the sequence, you're creating damage that you can't even measure now.
Hello and welcome to Collapse Life. I'm your host, Zara Sethna. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode. We're really happy to have you. Have you clicked those like and subscribe buttons yet? Please make sure you do so you don't miss a thing. So, as control gets centralized in fewer and fewer hands these days, one question we have to ask is who gets to control the seed, the soil, and ultimately the future of food? Here today to talk about that and other subjects is Jeffrey Smith, founder of the Institute for Responsible Technology. Jeffrey is one of the most prominent voices warning about the risks of genetically modified food and gene editing. And for more than 2 decades, he's been at the forefront of the GMO debate, exposing the hidden health, environmental, and social consequences of tinkering with our food supply. Now, with technologies like CRISPR and gene editing, the stakes are higher than ever. So, welcome to Collapse Life, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for being here to talk about these important topics.
Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful. And we have lots to talk about, but I think maybe just to start with some basics so people have an understanding. We mentioned CRISPR in the introduction. And for folks like me who have heard about this but don't know the fine details, can you just help us understand what this technology is and how gene editing is different from what we used to call genetically modified organisms, if there is a difference?
Well, they're both part of the same term, although the biotech industry is trying hard to pretend that they're not. Genetic engineering is a way of artificially manipulating the DNA. In the older varieties, they would take a gene gun and coat millions of particles of tungsten or gold with little chromosomes or little genes, gene packets, and send them by gun into a plate of cells, hoping that some of those genes would make it into the DNA of some of those cells. Or they would use bacteria to infiltrate and smuggle their gene packet into the DNA. Both processes cause massive collateral damage. You don't know exactly where in the genome your gene ends up, and you don't know what kind of side effects will be created. In fact, the number one most common result of that form of genetic engineering is surprise side effects.
Yeah.
Now, with gene editing, and CRISPR is one of a few different types, they target a particular sequence. It's as if there's a little guy in there with a clipboard looking for a sequence and saying, go there. And then they'll try to create a new structure of genes. They'll knock out genes, they'll rearrange, they'll delete. Now, the number one most common result of gene editing is surprise side effects. In fact, the journal Nature summarized 3 different CRISPR studies on human embryos as chromosomal mayhem.
Oh, wow.
There was deletions, additions, mutations. In fact, the process of gene editing can cause something called chromothripsis, which is a shattering of the chromosome and a rearrangement in a kind of haphazard way. We have a 6-minute video called 7 Reasons Why Gene Editing is Dangerous and Unpredictable on our site at responsibletechnology.org. And we do an animated journey into the DNA to show how additional gene fragments from bacteria or other animals can get added into a cell, how there could be all sorts of mutations, how there could be changes to the epigenetics, in other words, gene expression that can go on generation after generation after generation. They stopped at 10 generations of rodents. So the process is touted as being safe, predictable, and even natural, even though the results, according to science, are more random, unpredictable, and dangerous. But as we'll talk about, the biotech industry tends to gang up on regulators, all giving them the same talking points, and have convinced many governments that gene editing is safe,
Mm.
predictable, and natural, and therefore has stopped the regulation on them. Now, one of the interesting things is that CRISPR is so easy to do. You can buy a CRISPR lab for less than $2,000 and
No.
make new organisms on your own. High school students now go to class and are assigned to do CRISPR genetic engineering with the lab at the school. There are people that do it in their basement. It's now basically giving the keys to the kingdoms to virtually anyone because you're creating organisms that did not evolve from the billions of years of evolution, but once released, if they survive, they can self replicate and be there for generations and eons.
And we don't know how those organisms might react to each other or to the environment or behave. I mean, it's totally unpredictable, isn't it? Even though the biotech industry uses words like precision when they talk about gene editing and nice words like snip, like we're just going to snip a little piece of film and add it another frame and nothing will happen. So I did see that on your website, you have these 7 reasons why gene editing is dangerous and unpredictable. Can you walk us through just a couple of those?
Sure. Um, when the scientists want to target a particular location, they'll have that specific sequence in mind. But that same sequence can appear dozens or more times up and down the DNA, and it could target the wrong sequence. So you may end up looking for 20 different base pairs in a certain thing, and you may end up hitting it in 50 different locations,
Mhm.
causing genetic engineering to occur there, and it was never intended. Second, what you do is there's a cut that happens, and then you're hoping that the DNA repair mechanism of the cell will do it the way you want it to. But you have no control over that. And so what happens is the DNA repair mechanism can operate in a way that creates mutations at the site of the cut. It can
Right.
also grab whatever patching material, the DNA that may be in the petri dish, the DNA that may be there because of the bacteria that was used to get your gene editing equipment in there. So, for example, there were cows that were gene edited to not have horns. So, there were hornless cows, gene edited, and they looked using their superficial methods and said, oh, there were no mistakes, there were no side effects. And there was even a letter in the scientific journal to the regulatory agency saying, this proves that we should never regulate gene edited animals. This one study where we declare that it's safe means that you should not do any kind of regulation.
Wow.
Well, 2.5 years later, someone at the FDA received software analysis equipment and wanted to test it on gene information. And they just happened to have the genetic information of those cows, put it into their software, and lo and behold, they had missed something.
Mhm.
Every single cell of these genetically engineered cows, which were being bred now in Brazil to not have horns, had little pieces of bacterial DNA. In fact, 2 genes that were designed to create antibiotic resistance. Now, that means that if that antibiotic resistance genes transferred to genes in the gut bacteria or exposed to the cattle in any way, it might create antibiotic resistant diseases. And so
Mhm.
when this came out, they destroyed the cows, and it showed that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and that there needs to be in-depth analysis anytime you do a CRISPR study or a CRISPR experiment, and yet almost universally they don't. They assume that what the predictive algorithm is going to say happens. They don't analyze the proteins, they don't analyze the RNA, the DNA, the byproduct, metabolic byproducts, and yet all of these can be dramatically changed. And they're putting these things now into the food supply, not just releasing them into the environment.
How widespread is that? I mean, I think we've all been now conditioned or trained to start looking for little labels on our food that say GMO free, or, brands are actually using that as a way to sell their products. But if something is labeled GMO free, that doesn't necessarily mean it hasn't been gene edited. Is that true? And so how widespread a thing is this in our food supply?
It depends who tells you it's non GMO. The United States government has given loopholes in their supposed labeling scheme. The labeling scheme is almost worthless. They try and fake out people by calling it bioengineered, which people don't know what it means.
Mhm.
So under some rare circumstances, you may see something that says made with bioengineered ingredients. But most of the things that contain GMOs will not say that, because you can't find the DNA in the final product, because there's exceptions. And one of the exceptions is gene edited GMOs. That does not require any labeling. It does not require even that the government be notified if something is gene edited. So
Wow.
you can create gene edited lettuce or mustard, as a company did, and you can just put it on the market. Now, they chose to brag and boast and say the first gene edited products on the market are available at booth such in this conference. And I have the pictures of that. The problem is that you don't need any safety studies. You
Mhm.
don't need to analyze if your insertion has increased a toxin or an allergen or an anti-nutrient. And you don't have to test it, not just to analyze the composition, you don't have to test that on animals. You can just start feeding it to humans right away. Now, there is a gene rush given CRISPR, given that it's so cheap and easy. There's a sense of get my product into the marketplace now and start making money before the patent expires. But you can do it in a stealth manner and not tell anyone.
Mhm.
So if you look at the literature, there's always someone bragging and boasting to try and get money, usually for some gene edited product that's on the drawing board. And if you don't read carefully, you might think that there's tons of them now in the marketplace. Probably not. We can't say for sure because you don't need to say. But
Wow.
the ones that are bragging and boasting typically run into that one common effect of gene editing and genetic engineering, and that is side effects. So they haven't quite dialed it down, but that hasn't stopped them from trying to announce that they're doing it. Unfortunately, there's no mechanism to try and slow this down, and we could theoretically replace the food supply, but more importantly, we could replace nature, because there's ways to gene edit virtually anything with DNA and release it into the environment where it can never be recalled. The most common result not only is surprise side effects within the single generation, but they find that over multiple generations, there's other side effects that can occur. The most dangerous genetic engineered product to release in the environment, of course, are microbes, because they can replicate, dramatically, travel the globe, mutate, swap their genetically engineered genes with hundreds or thousands of different other species. And the microbiome, or the microorganism communities, are life critical to human health and to the environment. And those are the ones that the kids are genetically engineering in high school.
Yeah. It's so shocking what you're talking about. And yet, I mean, I think we understand that a lot of our food system has already been corrupted. And you just said, we could be changing nature completely. Is there a way to, once you're aware of what's going on, avoid this sort of thing? Because I know that there's a lot of even infiltration into the so-called organic food industry. Is there a way to actually kind of carve out a space where, as a family, we decide we want to eat as pure or as natural food as possible?
It's a very important question. Organic food does not allow the use of genetic engineering or gene editing. The biotech industry wants to change that, but so far there have been strong boundaries against that. Now, they don't require testing, and because of the stealth introduction, it's difficult for some organic producers to verify that every ingredient in the supply chain is
Mm,
pure and not GMO. We have the non-GMO project, that little butterfly seal,
mhm.
and they do require testing, and they do have a very competent team that analyzes what is a potential genetically engineered ingredient, and then they require a chain of custody and possible testing for the ingredients that go into the products that have a potentially genetically engineered supply chain product. So if you see something that's organic, which doesn't allow GMOs, and you see non-GMO project verified, then that's kind of the gold standard, because the non-GMO project did probably more work than the organic, depending if it's a complex product with a lot of different input. Now, what's interesting is if I had to choose between organic and non-GMO project, the non-GMO project just looks at GMOs.
Mhm.
Now, I've been studying and speaking about GMOs for 25 years, and one of the components of genetically engineered crops are the fact that they're sprayed with Roundup. Not all of them, but most of them. Roundup ready soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa.
Mhm.
Roundup, the chief ingredient, chief poison is glyphosate, gets driven into the plant and deposited mostly in the food portion. And studying glyphosate, it's clearly linked to so many diseases, as are GMOs. We can actually review some of those diseases to see if some of your listeners go, uh-oh, I better stop eating GMOs and Roundup.
Yeah.
Now, the non-GMO project doesn't have any comment about glyphosate or Roundup. Organic foods don't allow it. Sometimes there's drift, sometimes there's contamination, but you really want to avoid both.
Mhm.
And I think this would be a good time for me to share some slides.
Yeah, fantastic.
Now, before I do, let me say this. Glyphosate-based herbicides like Roundup are sprayed on Roundup-ready crops, but they're also sprayed just before harvest for beans and grains, for wheat, for oats, for chickpeas, lentils, mung beans. So
Mhm.
they're in high concentrations of those. Glyphosate-based herbicides are also sprayed on the rows between grapes, so they're in wine. They're sprayed on the ground in orchards, so they're in orange juice. So it's quite pervasive, and the organic doesn't allow it. There may be contamination because it's actually in the rain at this point. It's in the air because of the 300 million pounds used in the United States per year. So it may
Mhm.
be impossible to avoid 100%, but you certainly want to take steps to avoid it. And I'm going to give you some reasons, some excuses why. I'm
Super.
going to I'm going to show some charts here, and the charts are correlational, which doesn't prove causation. So let's hear. It's not, there we are.
There it is.
So inflammatory bowel disease. Okay. Now these bars are the amount of inflammatory bowel disease in the United States. And these are the dates below. You'll notice this orange line here, or yellow line. It's the amount of glyphosate sprayed on soy and corn, the
Wow.
two major GMO crops that are designed to be sprayed with Roundup. And you'll notice that it rises pretty much in parallel. Now, again, this is not proof that the glyphosate causes the inflammatory bowel disease. But we have animal feeding studies that show that when animals are force fed glyphosate, they result in symptoms or diseases like this. We
Wow.
have individuals who say that when they stop eating GMOs and Roundup, when they switch to organic, they get better from this and other diseases. We have the biochemical pathways that explain why this relationship may be a causal relationship. So we have a bunch of other information that gives those of us who have some expertise confidence that this is not just a correlation, but it indicates causation. But you'll want to look at the whole to see. So, what
Mhm.
I'm going to do is I'm going to go through many different slides very, very quickly. And I will just read the inflammatory bowel disease or whatever the title is. And then you can look at just the relationship here. Now, some of them have just the glyphosate, and others also have the percentage of GMO soy and corn in the United States compared to the total. So this is deaths from obesity. Here we have one other thing. We have a trend line. What would be the prediction of where obesity would be if something different didn't happen? And here we have the glyphosate applied and the GMO soy and corn. And here's where it would have been a dramatic change from deaths from obesity, anxiety, diabetes, deaths from Alzheimer's, deaths from Parkinson's, deaths from hypertension, autism in 6-year-olds, nearly a perfect correlation. And we can talk about this and the interesting way that we discovered or that Dr. Stephanie Seneff made this correlation. Insomnia. I'd love to talk afterwards about the obvious reasons why glyphosate causes insomnia.
Mm-hmm.
Celiac disease, and also it's related to gluten sensitivity. Acute kidney injury, death from kidney failure, kidney and renal pelvic cancer, liver cancer, liver and bile duct cancer, thyroid cancer, deaths from leukemia, breast cancer, intestinal infection deaths, deaths from disorders of lipoprotein metabolism, peritonitis, hepatitis C, dementia, deaths from dementia, ADHD, schizophrenia, suicide by overdose,
No way.
birth defects, congenital heart defects, metabolic disorders in newborns, genitourinary disorders in newborns, skin disorders, newborns with lung conditions, newborns with eye disorders, newborns with blood disorders, anemia, lymph disorders, deaths due to stroke. Now, here's a list of 28 different conditions that people reported getting better from when they switched to non-GMO and largely organic. Digestive problems was always number one in the 150 lectures where I did a informal survey with shows of hands. I took the same responses I got in the 150 lectures, made a survey, had 3,256 people fill it out, and 85.2% said digestive problems got better. Most of those people, 80% of those people, it was either significantly improved, nearly gone, or completely recovered. And we have fatigue and obesity and brain fog, anxiety and depression, food allergies and sensitivity, and we're still above 50%. You can see the others, it's quite substantial. Some of them fit hand in glove with the epidemiological evidence we just looked at.
Mm-hmm.
Amy Hart and I did this film, Secret Ingredients, where we interviewed many people who switched to organic, and they got better from many of these diseases. In fact, the doctors in those interviews say, these are not one-offs. These happen regularly in my practice when I put someone on a non-GMO and organic diet. And the scientists in the film explain why. So we have a lot of information that link GMOs with specific diseases. And we could, for example, look at a particular biochemical pathway like glyphosate stops the shikimate pathway in gut bacteria, which produce the precursor to serotonin, which gets translated into melatonin, which helps us sleep. So glyphosate, we block that whole metabolic pathway. And then when people stop eating GMOs and Roundup, when they switch to organic, they get better from insomnia. So we have the massive numbers in the United States gaining insomnia at high rates, and the people who wise up to eat organic get better from insomnia at high rates. So, and then we have, again, the biochemical pathway explaining exactly why it's the case with the particular hormone governing our circadian rhythms and sleep. So it's pretty obvious to us that GMOs and glyphosate are a major, if not the number one instigator of disease in the United States and around the world. But you don't have to take my word for it. Just switch to organic, get a little spreadsheet, put all of your symptoms on one side, your energy level, your mood, and on the top of each column, which is each day, the percentage of organic. Switch to organic for 2 or 3 weeks and watch the changes, energy level, brain fog, ability to concentrate. All these things can improve. And then you realize you're looking at your whole system, because you may just do it because you have a skin condition that you've seen or menstrual problems or joint pain. But when you look at the holistic effect, you realize, oh my God, what am I doing eating foods with GMOs and glyphosate?
Stunning. I mean, that presentation was very, very enlightening. So thank you so much for that. Obviously, one of the slides that you mentioned that we should go back to, and one of probably the most stunning slides that you just showed us, was about autism. Up until now, this is a word that we could almost not even mention in public. It's been such a third rail, but there seems to be an opening now in the public discourse to be able to talk about the case rate of autism and what possibly might have caused it. So Talk a little bit about what we're seeing happening here and what's behind it.
My friend Stephanie Seneff is a senior researcher at MIT. And she not only has a degree in biology, she has and she's an expert at computer science and bringing down big data for analysis of trends.
Mhm.
And she decided to use her expertise, which was putting, on both biology and big data, and pull down all the information on autism. And she said to me, she got everything that happens in an autistic body. She understood the biochemical relationships. So she understood why people with autism have the particular symptoms that they do. But she couldn't figure out the environmental insult that caused the specific changes in the physiology. So she used big data analysis and pulled down every toxin that she knew about, all these different pesticides and these different herbicides and whatever, and nothing fit that was causing the particular changes in the autistic model. Then she went to a lecture by another friend of mine, Dr. Don Huber, professor emeritus from Purdue University. And she said to me, she sat on the edge of her seat for 2 hours. Everything he said fit hand in glove with the autistic research. She went home, pulled all of the data from glyphosate, and it was like, this is it. This is exactly what's causing the problem. Then she gathered all of the autism in 6-year-old data and plotted it against the amount of glyphosate of that year. And it was pretty close to this, but not as close to this. And then, of course, you knew that if someone's autistic at 6 years old, they've had exposure to glyphosate for their whole life.
Mhm.
So let's look at 6 years of exposure. But because of the way the data was found, she could only do 4 years, the current year and the previous 3 years. So when she added the previous 3 years of to the autism equation, the correlation became almost perfect. A perfect correlation is a 1. This is 0.9972.
Wow.
And that's basically how many people are autistic at 6 years old and the total amount of exposure to glyphosate over 4 years, the amount of glyphosate sprayed on soy and corn. Now, in my film Secret Ingredients that I did with Amy Hart at secretingredientsfilm.com, you will meet 2 families that switched to organic. And they had each of them had sons on the spectrum. And both of them, when they switched to organic, the sons are no longer diagnosed on the spectrum.
Amazing.
And we have another film I did called Genetic Roulette, where 3 different families talked about dramatic improvements in their autistic sons. They were still diagnosed as autistic, but there was a dramatic improvement when they switched to organic. So I've talked to one woman who said, I used to tell people all the time that my son is 80% repaired or 80% healed from autistic symptoms. And they'd say, what did you do? And they said, well, I took him off of casein and I took him off of dairy, and we're about 80% organic. And then she'd say to the next person, he's 80% recovered. And then, oh yeah, no casein, no gluten, and we're 80% organic. At a certain point, she realized 80% recovered, 80% organic, and realized maybe we better close the gap. Switch to 100% organic, and now she described it as he's like 99 point something recovered.
Yeah.
That closed the gap. So many of us believe that glyphosate in particular is a leading driver of autism. It doesn't mean it's exclusive, because glyphosate, was not even invented when autistic symptoms were showing up. But glyphosate is used so much that it has developed its own set of diseases and enhanced certain diseases.
Right.
It damages the mitochondria, which is linked to numerous diseases. It kills off beneficial gut bacteria, which is linked to all these diseases. It causes leaky gut, which is linked to virtually all diseases. It prevents the absorption of minerals, which is linked to all these different diseases. It can prevent or suppress digestive enzymes and the digestion process, which is linked to all these different diseases. It can interfere with intercellular communication. All of these things are foundational. On top of that, it blocks the ability for the liver and our cells to detoxify other toxins. So all these other toxins, which are normally ushered out of the body, become interfered with, and they then have a bigger impact on the body in the presence of glyphosate. So it's very nasty.
Hmm. I mean, thanks to efforts like yours and some of the people that you've just mentioned, there's more attention and awareness now on the dangers of glyphosate than certainly maybe 10, 20 years ago. And obviously, because of that, there's a huge pushback from the industry, and we're seeing lawsuits, we're seeing state level legislation where they're trying to have chemical companies or pesticide companies be shielded from these kinds of lawsuits. So where are we at with that? And what do you think the sort of tipping point might be to finally address the glyphosate in our systems?
Well, it's interesting. This is a really interesting question because the answer is just fascinating. Bayer, the aspirin company, bought Monsanto.
Mhm.
Now, I put out to their shareholders, this is a terrible idea. Here's 8 undeclared liabilities, one of which was the health dangers of glyphosate. And within that was its cancer producing potential. Now, the World Health Organization then determined that glyphosate was a class 2 carcinogen, a probable human carcinogen. It did cause genotoxicity, which can lead to cancer. It caused cancer in rats that were exposed. When it was used in high levels, the population had more cancer, but they didn't do, studies where they feed certain people glyphosate and compared to others. So they said a probable human carcinogen. And then this resulted in lawsuits. The number one most correlated disease of the cancers was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so starting a number of years ago, there was a lawsuit against Bayer Monsanto, because Bayer bought it, and that resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars being awarded by the jury.
Yeah.
The stock price went down for Bayer more than the $63 billion they spent on Monsanto. So their stock price faltered. Ultimately their chairman was kicked out. The CEO had a vote of no confidence. It was a shareholder revolution against them. But during the lawsuits, more information came out. I've been studying how Monsanto lies and uses fake science to support, but there was a couple of examples that I wasn't aware of that came out in the Monsanto papers, millions of documents that were turned over. So when they had to get glyphosate or Roundup registered, they had to see the absorption level in human skin. So they took cadaver skin and put the Roundup and it absorbed, I was told 10%, according to the person that testified, which he said was about 3.3 times the allowable level. So they did a Monsanto research. They took new human cadaver skin and they cooked it. You know how you cook meat and it gets really tough? Wasn't good enough. And then took that cooked meat and then froze it. And then applied the Roundup, and hardly any got absorbed by this leather-like human skin facsimile. But they reported to the EPA the amount that was absorbed into that leather-like skin without telling the EPA that they had cooked and frozen the human skin. So they were defrauding the EPA. But they also had stationed in the EPA, as they do in many of the regulatory agencies, their own people, captive regulatory agencies. And so there was this one guy who was in charge of the cancer determination committee. And they were going to look at the research to see if glyphosate causes cancer. Now, we were able to find a letter from another EPA researcher who had to leave because she had breast cancer. But she wrote a letter to this man in the EPA saying, please determine that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. Here's all the reasons why. But you've just been doing things on behalf of the companies, you and this other person. And if anyone's taking bribes, it's her, because she doesn't make any sense. You have no she said, you don't have even the credentials or the ability to do the analysis. So please, for once, do it right. And I've done my job. And then later she died. And he was in charge of the glyphosate committee. And they only used an analysis later Monsanto studies, or primarily Monsanto studies, which were not good enough to publish in peer reviewed, which did not look at the whole formulation, which is far more dangerous than just the glyphosate itself. And they determined that there was not carcinogenicity. Further, he told his Monsanto handler, he said, there's another agency in the government that wants to do carcinogenicity tests to see if Roundup causes cancer, and I'll try and stop it.
Wow.
And if I can stop it, I deserve a medal. And there was more other things that he did before he retired. He leaked documents onto a website so Monsanto could copy them and then took them down, or so, allegedly. So there's an example of the captured regulatory agencies. And like the FDA, it's pretty obvious. The person in charge of the GMO policy was Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, later their vice president. He was also in charge of approving Monsanto's bovine growth hormone. And then working at the FDA was Margaret Miller, who did research for Monsanto on bovine growth hormone, and then headed the division that evaluated her own research. Right. And Susan Setchen, who had worked on Monsanto's RBGH, and then became the chief reviewer for the FDA of RBGH. So there's this revolving door, not just within these agencies, but also on the boards and the directorships going into the board of Monsanto. So now, given all the fraud that's been done in these agencies and to these agencies, now Bayer is saying if the agencies approved it, then there should be no legal recourse for people to get money from us for causing them disease and death.
Right.
Because obviously these agencies are doing a good job. Now, the agencies are doing a terrible job. There was an example where Monsanto hired someone who was an expert at genotoxicity to try and prove that their Roundup didn't cause cancer. And Dr. Parry said, oh, actually, there's evidence here that it probably does. And you only given me research on glyphosate. We need to do the whole formulation, which would obviously be worse. They fired him. They did not renew his contract. Monsanto ghost wrote a review study that said the opposite of what Dr. Parry said and paid people to sign it. And that became the primary source for the EPA to say glyphosate doesn't cause cancer. So there's all these manipulations and lies that go on at the agency level. And now Bayer, Monsanto, is saying we have to rely on the agency because they're the federal government's seal of approval, and there should be no ability for a state or any individual to sue because the U.S. government says it's okay. Right. So it's up for vote right now. So you can contact your state representative, your federal representative, and say, do not give Bayer or any of the pesticide makers liability shield protection for their products.
Yeah. It's really so pernicious, and it ends up being almost not even shocking anymore because we understand how corrupt and how bought and paid for all of this is. And yet, when you lay it out like you just did, and then we haven't even talked about how the media kind of carries water for all of this lobbying effort. It makes people feel a little bit overwhelmed and almost powerless to fight back. And so I think it's great, the work that you're doing and all the films that you do and really explaining it so carefully and clearly. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, one of the assaults on your criticisms in general about saying that GMOs or biotechnology or glyphosate are a danger. You often hear in response, well, we need this kind of technological advance to solve hunger, to solve climate change. We have these existential challenges that need to be faced. So we can't just rely on, organic eating practices or regenerative agriculture to solve this. We need to leapfrog. So yeah, tell me what you think. I mean, and I may have characterized that wrong, but there are
No, no,
some
you got it.
ludicrous arguments
Yeah.
against this.
So I was talking to Kirk Azevedo, who was a former Monsanto salesperson selling GMO stuff. And he was all excited about working for Monsanto because he was recruited and he listened to the words of CEO Robert Shapiro and how it would um, turn plant fields into factories and clean up processed waste. This big, beautiful picture. So he was at the new employee orientation in St. Louis in the headquarters. And at a certain point, he got up and repeated the words of Robert Shapiro for all of the other new recruits. And he was personally excited. And a vice president told him to stay behind and said privately, look, what Robert Shapiro says is one thing. What we do is something else. We're here to make money. We don't even know what he's talking about. It was all a front.
Wow.
When Monsanto started getting pushback on GMOs that were trying to be secretly introduced in the late 90s. They came out with a full page ad in Europe saying we needed to feed the world. It was just designed by their PR department. And then there was 28 delegates to a conference meeting at the time from Africa, and they wrote back a full page saying, don't use us as an excuse to put your poison on the market. And I've interviewed some of the world's experts at feeding the world, and they say no GMOs. In fact, there was a major 2,500 page study sponsored by the UN and 12 other organizations called the ISTAD report 2008. It basically dismissed GMOs completely. It said they have nothing to offer to meet our goals of eradicating poverty, feeding the world, and creating sustainability.
Wow.
I interviewed the chairman of that report and many of the chief writers. It was entirely a lie, but it sustained itself for year after year as part of the mystique. I remember in St. Louis, which is the headquarters of Monsanto. Years ago, I was at a Lindy Hop swing workshop. I used to do Lindy Hop. And during the break at lunch, I was at a Thai restaurant. I saw some other dancers come in. We waved them over. I never met him before. One guy sat right in front of me. I said, "What do you do?" He says, I work for Monsanto. I'm a scientist. Oh, what do you do for Monsanto? I do safety research on their GMOs. I'm like, oh my God, thank you. And because it was, lunchtime, we just had some light conversation about allergenic constructs, as you do. And then I said to him, when you insert the gene, you cause collateral damage in the DNA. It's called insertional mutation. Everyone knows it. He knew it. And I said, and so when you damage the DNA, how do you know that you're not damaging something that is important? And he said, well, we're discovering all the time what sequences are important. I'm thinking all the time now. It's still going on. You've been introducing GMOs to the population for years. I didn't say that. I said instead, what if it's all important? What if the DNA uses laws of nature, quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, things that we don't even know yet?
Mhm.
And by creating changes in the sequence, you're creating damage that you can't even measure now. He didn't say anything.
Mhm.
There was a long pause. One of the friends that came in with him said, that's deep. Still, absolute silence. It took almost a minute. And then he got up and goes, but we need GMOs.
Right.
And he described, the year 2050. And I knew he was actually believing that. I knew he was passionate. I knew he was wrong because I knew that actually it doesn't increase yields, and increased yields alone, even if it did, doesn't solve the problem of hunger. We have more food per person than any time in human history, and yet almost 1 billion people go to bed hungry. And that the world's experts say it's a problem of distribution and access, and et cetera, et cetera. Then I talked to another Monsanto scientist, and I was going very detailed analysis of the protein structures of the genes that were being inserted into corn and what they were producing and how it might cause allergies. And he was saying, well, this, and I was saying, well, that. And then at one point I said, but Rich, I think his name was Rich, that there's no way that you can guarantee that this is not going to cause an allergic reaction in at least some percentage of the population, because you can't tell until a multiple exposure. You can't tell because they've never been on the market before. It was obvious what I was saying. And his
Yeah.
response was, but we need GMOs. So he was willing to risk the first one was willing to risk unknown problems in the DNA. The second one was willing to risk potentially deadly allergic reactions because we need GMOs. And he said, I've been to India, I've seen their agriculture. Well, later on, GMO cotton was introduced to India, and they marketed it in a way that created desperate farmers, took out loans from loan sharks to, at tremendous interest,
Yeah.
um, and were not able to pay back their loans and were risking losing their land from their family and committed suicide. So 250,000 farmers planting GM cotton committed suicide. So this was the guy saying, I've seen the impact, I've seen the agriculture in India, and we need GMOs. And it was a disaster, huge disaster. So this concept of feeding the world is part of the regurgitated and recycled excuses,
Yeah.
and then they give it to a country saying you're going to fall behind these other countries. There's certain rhetoric that we've seen year after year. When they introduced the first types of GMOs, they said safe, natural, etc. Then they introduced gene editing, safe, natural, etc. The same words, the same rhetoric, and they figure out where they're vulnerable, and then they'll use words that counter that. Like, it's like when you say the fresh air legislation that's actually polluting, it's like we're healthier, we're more precise than normal natural breeding, which of course is not true.
Yeah.
And but they repeat that over and over again in order to confuse and neutralize critics and real science.
It's so fascinating because, as you're talking about these individual scientists who are working in this system, I mean, multiply that by tens of thousands, because these are huge multinational corporations and there are many, many people working within this system. Um, it's hard to believe that those people don't have cases of autism and cancer and inflammatory bowel disease in their families, and have a moment where they go, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And so, the fact that they are faced with these facts, they would have a conversation with someone like you over a lunch table and then retreat quickly to, but no, 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 we need it. It's a really interesting psychological study, and we've seen it play out over the last couple of years with COVID, and it just makes it feel like this is so deeply ingrained in us, and the narratives are so strong that how are we going to break through? And I mean, as you were talking as well, it makes me think of the same argument is happening now with AI, where we have all these people saying, well, we need artificial intelligence, and the innovations are happening faster and faster than we can even evaluate what the risks are. They're sort of two parallel tracks to biotechnology and artificial intelligence in a way.
Well, you've said a couple of things that I want to unpack. First of all, I remember talking to a former Monsanto scientist who said that 3 of his colleagues were testing the milk from cows that were treated with Monsanto's bovine growth hormone. They found so much cancer promoting IGF-1 in the milk, the 3 scientists stopped drinking milk unless it was organic. One bought his own cow. So, and I'm told by someone that she knew of an executive at Monsanto who refused to allow his kid to eat any regular milk, only organic.
Wow.
There was another study that he pointed out where the rats were fed GM corn and got diseased. So they rewrote the study to hide the effects, which didn't surprise me because I've worked with scientists that reverse engineer the data to show how it was covered up.
Mm.
Now, this particular scientist who no longer worked at Monsanto realized that the people in Southern Africa eat much more corn for much longer than the rats in Monsanto's study. Typically, Monsanto feeds 33% of the diet as the GM corn and only for 90 days. Whereas in Southern Africa, corn is a staple eaten 3 times a day.
Right.
So he was worried about the impact on the people in Southern Africa. I remember speaking to a veterinarian, a livestock veterinarian. One of his clients was in South Africa, and he gave him all these different suggestions of what to do because his cows were having problems, his pigs were having problems, serious health issues. And the guy said, "Look, just give me one thing to do." He said, "Okay, never feed him another GMO again." So he was planting the corn for his cows and pigs. So he planted non-GMO corn. He had been planting GMO corn and fed them. And all of a sudden, the pigs and the cows got better. Now it turns out that the workers on his farm were eating the same corn that he was growing. And while he was feeding the GMO corn to the animals and it was being eaten by his workers, they were getting sick at high levels. He had to keep 20% more workers employed, 60 instead of the 50 he needed, because there was always a certain number that were down. They had
Right.
flu-like symptoms, headaches, inflammatory symptoms. And he said to the veterinarian, once or twice a month, he'd be talking to one of the workers and he'd see the eyes not tracking together, but starting to cross a little. And he
Mhm.
knew from experience that within 1 or 2 days, that worker would be dead. And he had no idea why. When he switched to non GMO corn for the cows and pigs, the workers got better. So we have a situation where, they were the canaries in the coal mine eating more GMOs than anyone in the world, and were probably dying from it and having all these different diseases. Now, you mentioned AI.
Mhm.
One thing that is particularly scary is you can do gene editing with robots.
Mhm.
And you can set up a bunch of robots in an array and have AI generate all the different possibilities. So you're creating all these different things and you're testing them, and you're not necessarily looking out for what side effects you can know about, let alone the side effects you'll never know because we haven't evolved scientifically to evaluate all those different levels of nature. Um, I know enough about DNA to know that what they test for is paltry and infinitesimal compared to what can go wrong.
Right.
And yet, mostly they don't test for those either. So, by generating all of these different combinations, you're in a situation where you can be creating havoc done through AI. There's also a method of genetic engineering where you turn little microbes into factories. So, let's say you have algae or bacteria or fungus, yeast, and you insert a gene. Let's say you wanted to create an opioid. So you take a gene from an opium poppy and you put it into the yeast, and now it's producing a particular protein that you supposedly purify at the end and then use as a drug. Now, first of all, the purification is an important step. What if you don't purify and you get some other byproduct? Well, L-tryptophan was created by genetically engineered bacteria in the 1980s, and there were 5 or 6 contaminants in the final product, tiny amounts, less than 1.5% of the total. It passed the US pharmaceutical purity standard at 98.5%, and it still killed about 100 Americans and caused 5 to 10,000 to fall sick. You have things like the Impossible Burger, which takes a gene from a soybean, puts it into yeast, and it produces this red like hemoglobin, which has never been part of the human food supply. So it could easily be allergenic or toxic. But what they put into the burger also has 46 uncharacterized proteins that have come from this fermentation process, which they like to call precise.
Mm.
So these have never been characterized and might be causing diseases or disorders. So now you take the gene that was put into these things to create an opioid. What if there's contaminants? But it gets worse. What if the yeast that you use escapes? Is it possible? Of course. Even anthrax labs and flu labs in the CDC have had accidental releases, and
Yep.
these are factories.
Yeah.
So if it releases, now you have a yeast or bacteria or algae that produces an opioid. And so, what happens if it's producing an opioid and it gets on our food? Or worse, what if we ingest it? Now, genes are swapped between microorganisms. It's one of the ways that they're so intelligent, they kind of swarm and swap genes in order to benefit the host and their survival. So let's say we eat the yeast or bacteria or algae that produces an opioid, and it swaps that gene into our gut bacteria, and for some reason gives a survival advantage, so it now multiplies, and now we're producing the opioid inside our own digestive tract, or CBD, or some industrial enzyme that was produced from the hundreds of synthetic biology factories. That's what we're describing, synthetic biology factories that are using these micro factories of living organisms. And we're on top of that, we have up to 45 million acres of farmland that have genetically engineered microbes put on them. What if we ingest them? What if they escape? We have all these microbes that are being produced by high school students and college students with huge variety. What if they live long and prosper? What if they affect soil microbes that pull down carbon, algae that actually produce more oxygen than the rainforest, most of the Earth's oxygen, human microbiome, which determines whether we're healthy or sick, happy or sad? All of these things are at risk now in this pivot point in human evolution. We have come up now with a technology that can affect all living beings and all future generations accidentally. And yet we're giving a green light to anything that someone wants to do, that their kid does, that an AI does, and allowing it to get released into the environment for all future generations to deal with. So this is a time when we need to make that change and say, we need to protect nature now and not exploit it and change it, so that future generations can also inherit the products of the billions of years of evolution, and not a hybrid between man-made biological time bombs that go off generation after generation.
Wow. Jeffrey, very chilling warning. And I thank you so much for coming on and laying it out so clearly. Remind people what they can do to help in this fight and what they'll find if they visit your website.
So I would say there's two things I'd recommend. Go to responsibletechnology.org, find out how to eat non-GMO, basically organic, but look at the glyphosate residue index to make sure that if you don't eat organic, you at least avoid those foods that are high levels of glyphosate, and then look at the products that contain GMOs and avoid them as too. So if you can't eat organic, at least you know how to choose.
Super.
And then look also at the short videos, the 6-minute video called 7 Reasons Why Gene Editing is Dangerous and Unpredictable. Put it on your social media feeds, and look at a 16-minute film called Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle, which is about genetically engineered microorganisms. Now, if you are convinced or need convincing to switch to organic, go to a different website, secretingredientsfilm.com. There you can watch the film Secret Ingredients. You can rent it, you can get it permanently. It is the most convincing tool we've seen to get people to switch to organic. So it's also used, like if you hear this and go, oh yeah, I'm already an organic eater, but my parents won't listen to me. My spouse won't listen to me. My kids won't listen to me. My friends run away when I try and talk about food, which happens to us foodies. You then send them that and say, please watch this so we can have a discussion, or I'd like to get your opinion on this. It is remarkable how many people say, it worked finally for my spouse. It worked finally for my kids or my parents. It is something that it basically, you can do a pre-test and a post-test. What percentage of food are you eating that's organic? What percentage of food do you want to eat is organic? And within the 80 minutes of the film, people make a change in their lives. secretingredientsfilm.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all the hard work and all the advocacy that you have been doing. We're so glad that you're continuing to do it. And we're so glad that you came and joined us for this hour. We would love to continue the conversation in future as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Folks, if you found this conversation enlightening or shocking, please make sure that you do all the things that Jeffrey just suggested. And also, please make sure that you subscribe to this channel. Every week, we bring you voices like Jeffrey's, people willing to challenge official stories and open up new ways of seeing the world. You can learn more about who we are and why we do what we do at collapselife.com and sign up for our newsletter. And if our work resonates with you, please consider becoming a paid subscriber or making a one-time contribution through our Buy Me a Coffee page. That's how we keep this going. We thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We will be back next week with another unique perspective, and we hope you will join us again. And until then, remember to just keep your chin up. It's only collapse. See you soon.